Her jet shook so hard her teeth rattled while a voice in her headset repeated, "She isn't combat ready. Pull her out." At the same time, her missile tone screamed that she had a clean shot on the lead enemy fighter lining up on the convoy below. Kate Hale kept her thumb off the trigger for one more heartbeat because the order was on the record and every second was being logged. But down on the valley floor, the evacuation trucks were almost at the choke point, and the fuel timer in the corner of her HUD counted down toward bingo. If she obeyed now, she would climb, tearing away, and live long enough to be grounded. If she disobeyed, 9 hostile jets would turn toward her, and the only thing between those jets and unarmed people would be the woman the board had stamped "Not Combat Ready" in red. She fired because the convoy did not have time for the board to be right. The missile streaked out because she nudged a fraction more lead than Doctrine liked, and the lead hostile tore itself apart in a flare of metal and flame, which meant every other jet in that formation snapped their noses toward her instead of the valley. The controller swore in her ear because the unauthorized launch was now recorded forever, and a different warning tone started howling because debris from the exploding fighter punched into her right engine. Fuel numbers dropped faster because shrapnel ripped lines she could not see, and a new clock appeared on her display in harsh yellow digits, estimating minutes until the remaining engine starved and turned her miracle into a crater. "Classroom, you were told to observe only. Do you copy?" The mission lead's voice came through jagged and furious because the call sign he used was the one the squadron saved for jokes, not emergencies. She steadied her breathing because panic would narrow her vision, and she needed it wide enough to count every hostile nose swinging in. The 9 ship had been a pattern on a simulator screen yesterday, a formation she had warned them about and watched them shrug off. Now 7 missile icons burned toward her because the first blast had rattled 2 pilots enough to break away. She banked hard and dragged the threats toward rock walls and cloud gaps because the terrain here punished sloppy flying, and every maneuver she chose would either buy the convoy seconds or eat the last of her fuel before they were clear. Years of paperwork sat behind that one repeated line about her not being combat ready, a board's decision that her last big training save had been overly aggressive and better suited her to teaching than fighting. In the briefing room that morning, she had stood in front of the same men who signed that verdict, walking them through simulator slides that showed a 9-ship ambush wrapping around a convoy in this very valley, pointing at the radar shadows and choke points while junior pilots whispered Classroom's disaster movie at the back. They kept her on the roster as radio and Overwatch because the stamp on her file made it easy, and they kept the route because changing it would have meant admitting she might be right. She could have refused the assignment because regulations allowed an officer to recuse under safety concerns, but that move would have gone in the same file that already called her a problem. So she chose to stay, to bite down on her frustration and sign the duty roster as radio and Overwatch, because being in the air it all felt better than watching another unit fly into a pattern she knew by heart. That decision changed everything that followed. She knew the ambush was likely. She had predicted 9 hostiles, and yet because she wore the non-combat ready stamp, she was locked into a role that rewarded silence. When the colonel, pressed by schedules and budgets, chose to proceed without an extra escort flight, that choice sliced away their last clean option to avoid being outnumbered. Launch came on schedule because political calendars did not care about unease. On the runway, the younger pilots joked over the net because banter was how they handled nerves, and one voice said, "At least Classroom's in the back seat. She can grade our flying," which meant the rest felt licensed to treat her like a coach and not a fellow fighter. She answered with a clipped acknowledgement because arguing over comms would mark her as emotional on the record, and everything was always recorded. In the climb, her radar filled with moving symbols because the intel picture she had drawn was now overheated with real blips, and she saw the first hint of the 9-ship pattern forming at the edge of range. She keyed her MIC and delivered a calm advisory to mission lead because Doctrine said support assets provided information, not commands, and that restraint kept any formal abort call off the net. As the formation pushed deeper into the valley, the terrain began to funnel them exactly as predicted, with mountains tightening on both sides like jaws because the planned route ran through the simplest corridor. Kate watched altitude, spacing, and closure because radar in that region skipped, and small timing errors became lethal. She repeated her assessment that the contacts were not random patrols but a deliberate encirclement. Yet mission lead answered with, We stay on plan. Classroom, we're committed. Which meant everyone listening heard her warning labeled as overreaction. She chose not to escalate into a full abort because her non-combat rating gave her no authority to override lead, and a wrong call would have buried her permanently. That obedience narrowed their options until the first hostile element peeled off and vanished into ground clutter, exactly the move she had circled in red on her slides. The first volley came when they were deep enough that turning back meant presenting hot engine tails to missiles because the kill box depended on them reaching that point before enemy weapons release. Missile indicators bloomed on her screen like a second sunrise, and she immediately called out bearings. But hostile fighters had timed their shots between radar sweeps, and the friendly lead took a hit before he even finished acknowledging. Because she had stayed in the support offset to maintain a wide picture, she was too far to physically block the incoming shot and had to watch his jet break apart, one wing tumbling, a parachute blooming late. Debris from the explosion scattered through her path, and she cut across it because the only alternative was climbing into another salvo. Shrapnel tore along her right side, punching her engine and killing half her HUD symbology, and that damage was the direct price of having obeyed instead of taking an earlier, more aggressive position. Comms crowded with shouts and overrides, and she clung to procedure because someone had to log what was happening if they ever wanted to understand it. She reported hits, identified who was still flying, and tried to stitch together a new picture from fragments of telemetry because several jets broke formation in panic. That discipline left no one on net to bark hard commands. Support assets were discouraged from taking charge over more senior pilots. As one jet pulled high and another dove for the deck, the coordinated plan dissolved, and the 9 hostiles pressed in, exploiting every gap because they had rehearsed this pattern too. Each second she remained within the observe and report cage let the enemy close, and below, the convoy drew nearer to the choke point where escape would be impossible. It was in that collapsing moment that she flipped the redundant recorder on because some part of her still believed in future training, even if she did not live to teach it. The standard systems were already logging, but this backup was hers, an external drive mounted near her knee that captured HUD and audio off a separate power feed. She had developed the habit in the simulator bay because seeing exact sequences helped younger pilots avoid repeating mistakes, and it had become part of her pre-flight checklist even when others rolled their eyes. As she bumped the switch with a gloved finger, a pilot on the net muttered, "Of course classroom's recording this," which meant there was now an audible acknowledgement that her own recorder was live. That tiny choice, made under stress for a future that might not come, laid the foundation for every argument she would later make when the system tried to bury her. The kill box locked completely when a second hostile element dove through a cloud gap and fired on a straggling friendly, and the scream in that pilot's voice told Kate he knew he could not outturn it. She could see the angle. She knew a savage crosscut might throw off the missile's tracking, but doing so would drag her sight line away from the bulk of the enemy heading toward the convoy. Because she had accepted her support role, she had kept extra separation instead of flying tight cover, which meant she was seconds late to intervene, and the missile struck, shredding that jet into spinning pieces. The explosion lit the valley and briefly fuzzed her radar. When it cleared, friendly numbers were down, hostile numbers were unchanged, and the convoy's icon crawled steadily toward the worst stretch of road on the map. Her restraint had done exactly what she feared. It had made disaster worse while preserving nothing except the illusion of discipline. With their lead gone and 2 jets down, a hole opened in the chain of command that Doctrine had not prepared for, because no one expected the non-combat ready support pilot to be the one with the clearest head. She heard the mission lead, limping his wounded aircraft on the edge of the fight, declare that she was still observe only because his last intact power was to preserve hierarchy. That insistence on order meant he would rather risk losing the convoy than admit the paperwork that sidelined her might be wrong. She could hear ground controllers rising in pitch as they demanded updates from a valley where radar coverage was patchy, and every non-answer bled seconds from lives. The choice came in a single breath while her jet shuddered and the remaining hostiles rearranged themselves into a loose net between the convoy and the open sky. She could follow orders, climb, and leave the valley, offering commentary as friendly ground units were torn apart, or she could reach back to every emergency clause she had ever memorized and declare a situation that freed her from the chain that was strangling them. She saw her own sim diagrams in her mind, the ones where a single unpredictable element broke an ambush rhythm, and her thumb hovered over the MIC switch. Because she had spent months drilling rookies on procedure, she knew the exact phrase regulation allowed when command was incapacitated and lives were imminently threatened. So she pressed the switch and, with her voice steady because panic would give any future board an excuse, she declared herself temporary lead under the emergency defense article and shattered the invisible wall her rating had built around her. Shock hit the frequency like silence because no one expected Classroom to say those words. One pilot protested that she was not cleared, but his voice cracked because his fuel was low and missiles were inbound. She did not argue. Instead, she gave a vector, altitude, and formation instruction in the same calm cadence she used in simulators, and 2 surviving jets obeyed out of reflex. That obedience gave her just enough shifting metal in the sky to force the enemy net to adjust, which opened a narrow lane from the convoy to the far exit of the valley. She turned her damaged jet toward the densest knot of hostiles because if she did not draw their noses, they would still have numbers to split and kill both her and the people below. Arming her weapons broke the last formal barrier between her and the charges waiting on the far side of survival. The HUD flashed warnings as she switched from safe to hot, and the controller on the outside frequency shouted her call sign followed by an order to stand down because everything was being recorded. She did not answer because answering would admit doubt. Instead, she committed her vector and rolled into the same aggressive maneuver that had once gotten her nearly cashiered. Back then, it had been a training run that bent metal and saved a wingman from terrain. The board had called it recklessness. Now, with live missiles and real enemies, that same slashing cross-turn forced 2 hostile jets into each other's avoidance bubbles, and as they jerked aside, she fired twice, taking them both because their evasion collided with her pre-planned funnel. The count climbed because she fought the ambush like one of her own simulations, anticipating the habits of pilots who thought they owned the sky. Every time she guessed where a hostile would go to regain an energy edge, she was there first, overrolling or undercutting with moves she had taught on a screen but never been allowed to use in combat. Her body screamed under G-load because the damaged A-frame did not want to do what she asked, and warning lights blinked like a city at night, but each successful shot tightened the enemy's panic. At 5 kills, one of the younger pilots, voice thin, asked where she wanted him, and the old nickname sounded different in his mouth because fear had sanded off its mockery. She put him and the other survivor on the convoy's flanks while she stayed in the middle, taking the heaviest fire because she had made herself the center of the fight. Fuel numbers kept dropping, and every high-G boost cost more than the last because her right engine was bleeding efficiency with each second. She began trimming off fancy moves, switching to harshly efficient ones that traded speed for certainty, because the clock now lived in both her tanks and the convoy's position. When the 7th hostile tried to climb out and drag her after him, she resisted the bait because chasing would pull her away from the valley and leave a gap for someone else to slip through. Instead, she snapped a shot at an angle Doctrine would have frowned at, trusting her practiced sense of missile behavior more than the manuals, and watched the hostile disintegrate, which kept her anchored over the center line where 2 remaining jets boxed themselves in, desperate to find a path past her that did not exist. The 8th kill came in a head-on pass because one hostile believed her damaged jet could not pull enough lead. She let him close, nudged her nose just enough, and fired at the last reliable moment before their relative speed made tracking unreliable. His missile left his wing at nearly the same time, and both speeds of fire crust. Hayes found metal. His found the turbulent wake of his own dying aircraft and lost lock. The explosion buffeted her already wounded jet, and an electrical surge took out a cluster of secondary systems, which meant she was now flying mostly by stick, instinct, and a partial HUD. The 9th hostile, suddenly alone in a sky that had belonged to him minutes before, broke hard and tried to run. But with the convoy almost clear of the valley, she knew letting him go would leave a hunter on their trail. So she dragged the last of her fuel into one more committed chase, trusted the math in her bones, and clipped him with a shot that barely had energy left to fly. When the last hostile vanished from her scope, the valley felt too quiet because combat silence is louder than gunfire. Ground controllers reported the convoy moving through the far exit intact, voices cracking as they realized they were still talking to people who should have been dead. She ordered the remaining friendly jets to turn for home on the most efficient route, which meant she was giving away the chance for them to escort her. She needed their fuel for future missions more than she needed an honor guard. The controller on the high-frequency channel told her to declare an emergency and head for base, but her fuel numbers already said that was fantasy. She scanned her map, saw a small marginal strip within reach if nothing else failed, and chose the path that would give her a chance to live long enough to answer for what she had done. She informed controllers of her intention to attempt an emergency landing at the closer strip because she refused to punch out and let a crippled jet fall into the wrong hands. Ejecting would have made her a clean martyr and left the crash as an abstract loss of A-frame, but it also would have gifted a mostly intact fighter to whoever reached it first. Because she cared about what her aircraft could do in the wrong hands as much as she cared about her own skin, she wrestled the wounded machine toward the rough runway, accepting that any mistake would kill her. Systems died in stages because the earlier hits had shaken loose more damage than first appeared, and by the time she lined up, she had partial flaps, unreliable brakes, and almost no meaningful instrumentation. She landed anyway, riding the jet down in a shower of sparks and torn metal. And when it finally ground to a halt at the far end of the strip, she was alive. The jet was mostly in one piece, and every choice she had made lived inside the black boxes and drives the crew was already unbolting. They took her helmet before they took her statement because regulation treated her as both patient and potential offender. Medics checked her for concussion and broken ribs while military police hovered at the edge of the tent, careful not to touch her yet making their presence obvious. She answered questions about pain and vision with the same calm that had marked her call-outs in the air because she knew any sign of hysteria could be used later to undercut her judgment. When a young sergeant asked for her ID card, his eyebrows jumped at the name that matched the call sign he had heard all afternoon, because he had grown up hearing that classroom never left the ground. She noted his surprise, said nothing, and mentally followed her redundant recorder as it was carried away with the rest of the wreckage. The formal notice of investigation came within hours because anything involving downed aircraft and disobeyed orders triggered automatic procedures. While she lay in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and dust, a legal officer read her the articles she might have violated, each one a potential path to demotion, confinement, or discharge. He emphasized her non-combat ready status as if it were armor for the institution, proof that they had tried to keep her from danger and she had stepped into it anyway. She listened carefully because every phrase he used would reappear in paperwork, and paperwork could be massaged unless anchored to something harder than memory. When he finished, she asked one thing, that the full flight data, including radio logs and HUD footage, be reviewed before any recommendation, and he agreed readily because he assumed those records would support the case against her. Rumors outran documents. By the time she was allowed to sit upright, she heard fragments in the corridor. 9 jets? No. 7. The convoy saved by some maniac in the air. The pilot not even rated for combat. Awe and suspicion mixed in every version. And when younger pilots from the mission visited with careful words and shocked eyes, she told the one who thanked her to write down what he had seen before anyone else told him the story, because even memory could be steered. The inquiry panel met in a clean room with a long table and recording devices sitting like extra witnesses. Across from them, she sat in a uniform that still smelled faintly of jet fuel despite fresh laundering, a quiet reminder that she had been where their questions came from. They began with the papers because that was their world. Mission plan, field orders, evaluation reports, the old bard's not combat-ready conclusion. On paper, she looked like a pattern, a past training accident, a record of sharp critiques and simulators, a career redirected into teaching instead of fighting. Based only on that, the chair spoke of reckless escalation and disregard for direct orders, and another member hinted that she might have been chasing personal vindication. They had not watched the footage yet because procedure let them front-load their interpretation with documents, which meant the story was already leaning against her. When they asked if she understood the severity of her alleged disobedience, she said she did because acknowledging reality gave her credibility. When they invited her to make a statement, she did not plead or explain fear. Instead, she asked that full HUD and radio logs be played from 30 minutes before first contact to touchdown, uninterrupted. The panel exchanged looks, their own clock ticking because higher command wanted a quick answer, but protocol and curiosity forced them to agree. An officer signaled the tech, and the first frames lit the screen. The official recorder from her jet had survived with gaps where damage had briefly cut power, and one panel member seized on those, suggesting the footage could be incomplete or misleading. Kate let the comment hang because addressing it too early would invite them to focus on absence instead of presence. As the video rolled, the room listened to her early warnings, to mission lead dismissing them, to the tightening pattern of hostiles on her radar. They watched her follow procedure, reporting contacts, maintaining discipline, obeying the observe and report directive as long as any sane person could. When the first friendly jet exploded and debris hit her aircraft, the panel leaned forward because the camera shook and the HUD flickered, confirming the gap the skeptic had pointed out. That was when she reached into the folder beside her and placed the redundant recorder on the table. She explained that months of simulator work had taught her the value of independent capture, so she had mounted a small device that drew power separately and recorded HUD and audio on its own loop. Because she had turned it on just before the ambush fully closed, it filled in every hole the official system had missed. The tech connected it, synced timestamps under her guidance, and replayed the critical minutes, this time without interruption. Now the panel saw the exact instant she invoked the emergency defense clause, heard the wording she used, and watched the maneuvers that saved jets and pulled hostiles off the convoy. Witnesses followed the evidence. Pilots who had survived stood behind her chair, not beside it, because the seating said she was the one on trial. They described what it felt like when lead went down and orders stopped, how the net filled with half-formed ideas until her voice cut through with vectors that actually worked. They admitted that they had joked about her ratings before, had called her teacher and classroom, but in the sky she had been the only one who sounded as if she had rehearsed this nightmare. Convoy officers sent statements saying a calm voice from above had walked them out of fire, a voice that matched the recordings now playing in the room. With each account, the narrative the panel had started with moved farther from reckless and closer to necessary. A senior combat commander was flown in to give expert assessment, a man whose own record was a wall of ribbons and hours in hostile airspace. He watched the key maneuvers 3 times without speaking. When he finally did, he pointed out the precise choices that separated survival from catastrophe. The decision not to chase the climbing hostile, the timing of the 8th shot, the refusal to eject early. He compared her reckless training maneuver with the one she pulled under live fire, showing that the early abort had punished the outcome, a bent wing, instead of recognizing its intent and math. This pilot did not get lucky, he said for the record. She executed at a level most combat-rated pilots never reach. Once spoken by him, that line became part of the institution's own memory. The panel's questions shifted tone. Instead of asking why she broke orders, they asked how she calculated angles with partial avionics, how she weighed fuel risk against convoy survival, why she chose the damaged strip rather than ejection. She answered with the same measured clarity she had used in the cockpit, always linking her choices to doctrine and to the emergency clause she had invoked and taught. When they pressed on her decision to declare herself temporary lead, she quoted the regulation about command incapacitation and imminent loss of life. Because the footage and the clause matched, the panel could not dismiss her move without attacking their own rules. Each answer tightened their corner. Either they accepted that their own system had worked only because she used it fully, or they admitted the paperwork had been more important to them than people. When they adjourned to deliberate, punishment was no longer simple. To make an example of her would mean contradicting their own regulations, the expert they had called, and the living witnesses whose loyalty now tied to her survival of that day. To make her a loud hero would spotlight the earlier misjudgment and the culture that had mocked her for cautious training and punished her for decisive combat. When they returned, the chair read a statement that cleared her of insubordination, acknowledged extraordinary performance under fire, and recommended that her non-combat rating be corrected. In the same breath, he added that significant elements of the mission and aspects of her record would be classified due to operational sensitivity, which meant the truth would be both kept and buried. Two stories of that battle spread. The official one lived in a short line on a wall, and in a promotion order most eyes slid past. A convoy escorted through hostile airspace. Aircraft lost. No lives lost. Commendations issued as appropriate. Her name appeared in a list, tied to a medal whose dry citation spoke of performance under fire, and never mentioned that the same file had once called her unfit. The other story moved in quieter routes, between benches in the gym, across tables in the mess hall, in messages pinged between bases. In that version, the not combat-ready instructor had taken a damaged jet into a sky full of enemies, killed 9 of them, and slammed her aircraft onto a rough strip rather than let civilians burn. And with every retelling, the phrase, not combat-ready, turned from judgment into a bitter joke. Leadership handled the contradiction by moving her. Reassignment orders sent her to a specialized unit whose work rarely appeared on any schedule, along with a promotion and a thicker folder of things she could never talk about outside secure walls. The letter framed it as recognition of her unique skill set and demonstrated capacity under high-stress conditions. But between the lines she saw another aim. Keep her where her existence proved the system could adapt, yet her story did not encourage open defiance. She accepted because staying inside offered more leverage than leaving, and because the witnesses whose lives she had saved already carried the version of her that mattered. On her last day at the old squadron, she walked past the simulator bay where she had spent so many hours convincing rookies that procedures were there to be understood, not feared. The curriculum had changed quietly. A new scenario based on an unnamed pilot who faced a 9-ship ambush over a convoy route now sat near the top of the syllabus. Students had to memorize the same emergency defense clause she had invoked in practice, making the call no one wanted to make, which meant her hardest decisions had been woven into training. She watched a group run the scenario until one muttered that the unnamed pilot sounded too perfect to be real, and she smiled because myth, carefully shaped, could protect the next person like her. Her original file, the one with the red "Not Combat Ready" stamp, did not vanish. Deep in a records vault, another mark in a different color overlaid it, one that signaled a classification level most clerks would never see. To anyone without clearance, the contradiction would remain, a line of text suggesting unfitness beside decorations that implied the opposite. To those who knew the deeper mark, the old label became darkly funny, a reminder of how close they had come to throwing away the weapon they most needed. In off-duty corners, whenever she outshot someone on a range or dissected an engagement with uncanny precision, someone would shake their head and say, "Good thing she's not combat ready," and the room would laugh in a way that hurt and healed at once. She did not get back the years she had spent sidelined or the version of herself that trusted the system to see clearly. What she gained instead was quieter, a small shift in how future pilots were trained, a legend that refused to die, and a shared understanding among those who had been there that labels could be wrong and sometimes had to be corrected under fire. On a plain morning that would never make the news, she walked down a restricted hangar line toward an aircraft whose designation would not appear on any public list. Ground crew stepped aside because her badge said she belonged and because the story had already reached them. As she rested a gloved hand against the dull skin of the machine, she thought of the convoy still moving somewhere in the world because she had refused to be what her file called her, and of the sky that had torn her old label away. Outside that narrow circle her name might fade, but inside it one truth stayed fixed. They had said she wasn't combat ready right up until the moment the fight proved they were wrong, and every mission she flew now carried that correction like a scar and a promise.